Hello, everyone. This is Sharon, creative producer for special project of Hong Kong New Music Ensemble. Thanks for joining us today in this session. We are very happy to have Ying Luo, scientists joining us here from Australia to talk about the wonderful world of insects in Hong Kong and beyond. Ying was an ant researcher at Longfushan Environmental Education Center at the University of Hong Kong. In 2016, she discovered a new species of ants, the golden tree ant, in Hong Kong during a research trip at the Pikshan Path, that is the walking trail right behind the center. So now I'm going to pass the time to Ying to share with us her insights about ant research and also the threats that that insects have when encountering climate change and environmental issues. Thank you, Ying.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Sharon. That was a very lovely introduction. Great, so I'll get right into my presentation. So yeah, I hope you guys can all see my slide. So today my presentation is titled The Wonderful World of Insects in Hong Kong and Beyond. So yeah, Sharon, yeah, as she said, I will just talk a little bit about insects in general, Hong Kong insect research, a bit about conservation. So it's a bit of a mixture, and there'll be time to ask me a question at the end. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I was born in Australia, hence the accent, but I lived and worked in Hong Kong for a number of years. And I was not only a research assistant, but I also did my MPhil there. So I'm a 2020 graduate. And yeah, so as Sharon mentioned, in 2016, I also discovered a new species of ant. So I'll talk about that later. Some of you may have seen this picture before. So broadly, what are insects? So insects actually fall into the group known as arthropods. So a lot of the other organisms in the arthropod family you might actually think of as insects. So this group here are the spiders. So they have, so all the members of the arthropod family group, they have a hard exoskeleton, segmented body, and at least 3 pairs of jointed legs, but they can have more. So when you think of a spider, they have 4 pairs of legs or 8 legs. Centipedes, they have many more than that, and crustaceans, etc. So insects are just like a subgroup of arthropods. So you might think of a spider as an insect. Strictly speaking, they're not, but you know, you can count that if you want. So, but what makes an insect an insect? So insects always have a 3-segmented body. So that means they have, so this ant picture here, so they have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So that's in contrast to spiders, which only have 2 body segments. And they have 3 pairs of legs and 1 pair of antennae. So when you think of insects, they're actually really, really diverse. So maybe when we think of a mammal or birds, there's about 6,500 species of mammal and 18,000 species of birds. So if you're trying to imagine all these species, that is a lot. Like, I don't think anybody could name all the different species of those organisms. But when you're thinking of insect diversity, it's actually much, much more diverse. So on this graph, you can see vertebrates are kind of like halfway down the graph, and they're just make up a very small percentage of overall global diversity. So insects are very big at the bottom. So 400,000 species of beetles, like heaps and heaps of species. So their diversity is really important and I think very undervalued. So when you think even within Hong Kong, we have a lot of, or we also have quite a diverse number of species. So just thinking of birds, even migratory birds, like we see more than 550 species of them just across Hong Kong. But moths and butterflies are 3 times that amount. So I think there's a lot of people who wouldn't have thought about the pure diversity of these insects. And because ants are kind of my favorite, I had to mention that there's 190 plus of them, and I'll talk about that plus a bit later. So insects are so diverse that there are so many that remain unknown to science. So even in Hong Kong, so in Hong Kong, it's so tiny, we still have a lot to discover within Hong Kong. So I said 400,000 species of beetle, but in reality, they think that there's more like 1 million. So I wanted to kind of include some allusions to the Sonic Ecology Conference. So one example of insect diversity is the insect antennae. So insects all have antennae, but they all vary in form. So here you can see that just their little sensing organs on their head all have different shapes. And I've included some photos that I took myself, all in Hong Kong, all in quite urban areas. So you don't need to go hiking or anything to see these insects. And you can already see that they have very different types of antennae. So the beetle on the left has very pectinate antennae. So they're quite, I don't know, antler-like. So this increases surface area so they can sense pheromones from at a larger distance. So this is a male and he's trying to find females. The butterfly on the other end has a very different type of antennae that are also feathered for a similar purpose. So they're even just looking at antennae, they're already quite diverse. But why are insects important? So I think a lot of people, maybe Hong Kongers in particular, think of insects, think of only the bad insects. So you see a lot of maybe termites flying around after rain, or mosquitoes biting you, or sandflies biting you. But there are many more roles played by insects that we think. So for instance, they're very important soil engineers. So they help turn the soil inside at different levels so that it gets mixed throughout the different levels of soil quite evenly and it becomes a more healthy ecosystem. I think a lot of people are very familiar with the idea of insect pollinators. Bees are the most well known, but beetles, hoverflies, ants, they all also play an important role in pollination. And they can also act as pest controllers. So for people who garden, we understand that ladybirds are really important because they eat all the aphids. And so without these really important insects, then those pests would probably go out of control. And another really big important role that they play is in decomposition, or in managing decomposition. So when something dies or falls to the ground, for instance, a piece of fruit, then the insects come in and they can break down these dead bodies so that and kind of remove them from the ecosystem and turn them into something more useful. So if we imagine no insects in the world, then there would also be all these like piles of dead organisms everywhere because the insects aren't eating them or managing them. So they're very essential. So this kind of moves into this idea of the insect apocalypse. So broadly, there was the Insect Concerto that was composed by a German composer, and one of his inspirations was this idea of an insect apocalypse. So I really thought it would be important to discuss it. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, in 2018, the New York Times published an article called "The Insect Apocalypse is Here," and I think it really grabbed a lot of headlines. And in that story, or in that study, they had found that over 27 years, they had sampled, they had kind of measured how many insects they were collecting in a container, and every year they found that there was less and less and less until 27 years later, there was 75% less insects. So this is quite alarming because you're thinking, where have all those insects gone? So this really gave rise to an idea of the insect apocalypse. But I think reading those headlines, when we dig deeper into it, it's not as grim as we might actually think. So there have been numerous reviews and looking at a number of studies. And so I really liked this graphic because so it shows that that the past studies that have been done on this type of research, like looking at population declines or changes, has really been isolated to a very specific number of countries and groups. So if you look at that list of countries, where are the Asian countries? you know, Australia's not on there, Africa's not on there. There's a whole number of countries that aren't represented. And there are only a few specific groups that are represented in the studies. So bees are very much present, but that's because they're very economically valuable. So that's probably why they've been researched. But all those other types of insects like beetles, ants, etc., aren't often counted in those studies. So I think it's important to understand that these studies are quite limited in scope, but some of them do really show a decline in those specific groups that they were studying. So does that mean that we can extrapolate from that and kind of say that all insect populations are declining? Not necessarily. I think that's a very important part of science, to kind of think about all these different aspects. There are some studies that have shown that insect populations are increasing certain types. So I think that's not as grim as we think, but insect population decline is something that we should consider in terms of conservation and future importance, and I'll go into it. So how do people measure population declines? Well, I think the most common or easy way we might think of is you might go out one day, count how many things are there, and then the next day you go out, count how many things are there, and population may have changed. That's a very easy way to do it. But I thought a very cool way to talk about today for this conference would be to talk about recording soundscapes. So a lot of what people do is they go out, they bring a huge microphone to record, to capture sound, and they record what they hear. So if you walked outside and just kind of stood there, that would be your ambient soundscape. So it might be quite urban if you're in Hong Kong, but it really depends. So it's used by a number of researchers, including bird researchers, to record bird calls. But what I wanted to share is actually this clip of this researcher who was doing studies in America. So he just recorded some soundscapes. So hopefully this works.
We can't hear the sound from the YouTube.
No. Okay, I'm really sorry. Well, maybe we'll link to it. But okay, so I think you can kind of see from the visualized sound waves that in the first example, there were just many more bird calls and insect calls and frog calls. And then in the subsequent recordings, it was much less. And so it just became a silent kind of environment. It's very sad that you guys couldn't hear it. I would just recommend you Google this video. So this is what extinction sounds like. It's only 3 minutes long. So it's a very interesting video. See if I can. Okay, so what drives these declines and changes in soundscape? So or even just in observed abundance. So I think the major one that needs to be discussed is habitat loss. So that's due to maybe conversion of forests to agriculture or to residential land. So that's really, really big. And so as I mentioned, there's a large proportion of insects and other organisms that are undescribed. And you can imagine that if a whole forest is destroyed and we haven't had time to even look at what was there, then all that knowledge is lost. And what the best thing we can do to protect those insects is really to maintain the habitat that we already have. If we can restore existing habitat, but I think preserving what we have is also important. So in Hong Kong, we have a lot of country parks. So I think that's really valuable. So so in Hong Kong, even though you might think it's very urban and very small, we have a lot of insect research being performed. So across Hong Kong, there are a number of groups working on insect research, so mainly at HKU, also at Long Fusan, and there's a citizen science group collecting moth images, and I'll talk about that later. And there's even individuals who are very expert on their groups of insects, and they're not affiliated with any university. So there's a lot of people doing work on insects. For me personally, I'll talk about a little bit about my story, about how I found my ant. So, as previously mentioned, in 2016, that was the year that I found this ant, and it all happened when I was hiking. So, for those of you who aren't based in Hong Kong's located south of China. And so, where I found this specific ant was on Hong Kong Island, right near HKU, and actually right near the Longfusan Environmental Education Center. So, a very urban place. And what happened was that I was walking along and I noticed this insect that looked very different to any of the ants I'd previously seen. I'd already done a lot of research on the existing ants of Hong Kong. I kind of knew what was familiar and what wasn't, and this was definitely unfamiliar. What I did is I collected it and I took it back into the lab. And when I looked at it under the microscope, I had definitely not seen it before. And so that was the beginning of realizing that this was something new. And so that really led to me and my supervisor, Dr. Benoit Gounard, going through and formally describing this as a new species. So what I want to talk about is what is the difference between description and discovery? So I was definitely not the first person to have ever seen this ant. But in science, what is done is organisms are given scientific names, and that's to help distinguish them. There's a lot of common names that are used for things. Like an example I give here is a tiger or lion, but I think they're quite distinctive, so we know what we're referring to. But this ant, for instance, is known by different names across different countries. So in Hong Kong, in English, you might call it a weaver ant, but in Australia, we would call it a green tree ant. But actually, they're the exact same species. So to help scientists distinguish what we're talking about, we give it a scientific name, and that's what we refer to it by um, in uh, in articles, and then that way everybody knows that we're on the same page. So what we did is we scientifically described this as a new record and new species for Hong Kong. It was just something very different. So I named it Paratopula bohenia. Bohenia is the floral emblem of Hong Kong. And subsequently to that study, actually there's been more than 20, maybe 25 new species of insect described in Hong Kong. So that's pretty impressive. There's a lot still yet to be discovered and is being discovered in this very urban environment. And so hopefully this has gotten you a bit interested in kind of learning about how you can get involved or maybe learn more about insects in Hong Kong. So I've mentioned, I want to mention some things you can do. So one easy thing to do is to go to K11 Musea in TST. There's a very big new mall there, but they have an exhibition on insects that's been managed by my old lab at HKU, and it's very interesting. So it's on, the 8th floor, but I guess you can look it up. That's a good way to kind of see some insects up close. What they've done is they've uh, displayed some insects for you to look at, so you can see them without them flying away. And I would definitely recommend the Longfusan Environmental Education Center near HKU, very accessible. They're always there with field guides, binoculars, whatever you need. And they always have interesting exhibitions. So I would go there, and citizen science BioBlitz events. So you can sign up there and learn a bit about Hong Kong biodiversity. Another interesting project is this iNaturalist app. We all love our apps. So I would say you can download this app on your phone, and it really essentially you just take a photo of something, it goes up onto the internet, and then somebody will identify it for you, an expert, and then you can find out exactly what it is. So it doesn't just have to be an insect, it could be a bird or anything else you see. And that's a good way to kind of learn your your Hong Kong local diversity. And so there's currently a Hong Kong moss project going on to really understand how many moths are in Hong Kong. So I think so if you're interested in contributing to that research, then you can just take some photos of some moths. And with all this light going on in Hong Kong, there's a lot of moths that are attracted to them. So you could just do that from your home. So I think that's those are some very easy ways for you to learn a bit more and get involved in Hong Kong insect research. So yeah, it seems like I've reached the end of my talk on time. And so I just really want to thank everybody for participating and for being invited to speak. If you want to learn more about my own research and my future projects, you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter or whatever. Yeah, so thanks again.